She showed up looking like something the storm had already finished with. 11 days on washed-out roads, a broken wagon axle, 2 nights sleeping in mud so deep it pulled at her boots like the earth itself wanted to swallow her whole. And still she knocked on that door. Caleb Ashcroft opened it, expecting a schoolteacher. What he got was a woman standing in the rain with hollow eyes and shaking hands, her blue dress caked in dirt, her voice barely holding together when she said the words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "I understand completely if you want me to leave." He didn't say a word. He just stepped aside and held the door open. And if you've ever wondered whether one quiet act of kindness can change everything, stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since morning, and by the time the wagon rolled into sight of the Ashcroft Ranch, it had settled into the kind of slow, relentless drizzle that doesn't announce itself with thunder. It just wears you down until you forget what dry felt like. Caleb Ashcroft was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the horse. He set the axe down against the chopping block and wiped his hands on his trousers, more out of habit than any expectation of company. Nobody came out this far without a reason, and most reasons weren't good ones. He walked around the side of the barn and stopped. The wagon that sat in his yard looked like it had survived something. One of the rear wheels had a crack running through the spoke that someone had wrapped tight with leather strips and rope. A desperate repair, the kind you make when you have no other choice and miles still ahead of you. The horse pulling it was a dun mare with her head down, too tired to even register his presence. And on the seat of that wagon, gathering rain like she'd stopped noticing it, sat a woman. She was looking at the house. Not at him. At the house, the way a person looks at something they've been trying to reach for a very long time and still can't quite believe they've arrived at. Caleb stood there a moment. He'd been expecting her, or rather, he'd been expecting someone. The woman from the letters. The schoolteacher from Ohio who'd answered his advertisement in the Frontier Correspondence Gazette. The one his neighbor Ruth Halverson had talked him into placing after 18 months of watching him raise 2 children on black coffee and stubbornness. The letters had been coming for 4 months. Careful letters. Considered letters. The kind a person writes when they're trying to be honest without scaring anyone off. But the woman in those letters had described herself as practical, composed, experienced with difficulty. The woman sitting in his yard looked like difficulty had been following her with a personal grudge. He walked toward the wagon. She heard him then and turned, and he got his first real look at her face. Brown eyes, dark with exhaustion. A jaw set in that particular way people set their jaws when they're trying to hold something together by force of will alone. She was younger than he'd imagined, maybe 30, maybe a year or 2 past it, with dark hair that had pulled loose from its pins and plastered itself against her neck in wet strands. There was a long scratch along her left cheekbone, already scabbing over, like something from a branch or a fall. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Mr. Ashcroft." Her voice was steadier than her hands, which he could see gripping the reins like she needed something to hold on to. I want to say first, before anything else, that I understand completely if this isn't what you were expecting. I know I don't look." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started over. "There were problems on the road, several of them. I'm 11 days late, and I'm aware of how I must appear right now, and I won't be offended if— Miss Rowan." He said her name deliberately, not to cut her off, but because she looked like someone who needed to hear that he already knew who she was. "When did you last eat?" She blinked. It was clearly not the question she'd prepared herself for. Yesterday morning, I had some dried— Come inside." "Mr. Ashcroft, I really think we should discuss—" "We can discuss anything you want," he said, moving to the horse and taking hold of the bridle. "After you've eaten something? Can you get down, or do you need a hand?" There was a pause, long enough that he looked up at her. "I can get down," she said, with a quiet fierceness that told him it was important to her to be able to do it herself. She did, though not gracefully. Her left leg had stiffened up, from the cold probably, or from sitting too long in one position, and she stumbled when she hit the ground, catching herself on the wagon wheel with both hands. She stood there a moment with her back to him, just breathing, and he pretended to be very interested in unhitching the mare. When she turned around, her face was composed again, or composed enough. "Thank you," she said, for that." He nodded and led the horse toward the barn, without making a thing of it. The kitchen was warm. That was the first thing Eliza Rowan noticed when she stepped through the door. Actual warmth, not just the absence of wind, but heat from a proper stove, radiating out into the room in a way that hit her like something physical. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment and let it happen to her. The kitchen itself was functional. That was the honest word for it. The table was plain pine, scrubbed clean but unadorned. The shelves were organized with a kind of military efficiency that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with someone trying to keep a household running without enough hands to do it. There were 2 cast iron pans hanging from hooks near the stove, a blue tin coffee pot, a window above the dry sink that looked out onto the yard, its glass smeared with the kind of grime that accumulates when nobody has the time or the heart to wipe it away. It was the house of a man who was surviving. Just surviving. The whole place had that feeling. Eliza set her traveling bag down near the door and took off her coat, which was so wet it dripped on the floorboards. She draped it over a peg near the door and then just stood there, uncertain what was appropriate, uncertain what anything was, really, in this strange, suspended moment between the life she'd had and whatever this was going to be. She heard footsteps overhead, small ones. Then, from the direction of the narrow staircase at the far end of the kitchen, a face appeared. A small, round face, framed by 2 blonde braids that someone had attempted that morning and only partially succeeded at. Wide blue eyes that were looking at Eliza with an expression of absolute undiluted intensity. The child was maybe 5 or 6. She was wearing a dress that was slightly too short for her, a winter dress from a year ago, Eliza guessed, that she'd grown out of, but that someone hadn't yet replaced. She had one hand on the banister and one foot on the bottom step, and she was staring at Eliza the way a person stares at something they've been waiting for so long, they're not sure it's real. "Hello?" Eliza said softly. The child said nothing for a moment. Then she came down the last step onto the kitchen floor and walked directly toward Eliza with a 4-year-old's complete absence of social caution, stopping about 2 feet away and continuing to stare. "Your dress is dirty," the child said. "It is," Eliza agreed. "I had a very hard trip." "Papa said you were coming on the train." "I did take the train, part of the way. Then I took a wagon, and the wagon had some trouble." The child considered this. "Did you fall down?" Eliza touched the scratch on her cheek without thinking about it. "Once or twice." "I fall down sometimes too," the child said, with the philosophical gravity of someone who has thought about this. "Papa says you have to get back up." "Your papa's right about that." Another pause. The child was looking at her with that same unnerving intensity, and Eliza had the feeling of being assessed in some way she didn't entirely understand. She'd spent 8 years teaching children of all ages, and she knew perfectly well that children were far more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. This one, in particular, seemed to be running some kind of internal calculation. Then the little girl took one more step forward, reached out, and wrapped both arms around Eliza's waist. She just held on, not saying anything, just held on, with her face pressed into Eliza's damp, mud-streaked dress, as though she had been waiting to do exactly this for a very long time. Eliza stood very still for a moment, surprised past any prepared response. Then carefully she put one hand on the back of the child's head. The back door opened. Caleb came in from the barn, stopping short when he saw them. His daughter pulled back just slightly and looked up at Eliza, and in the uncomplicated, fearless way of young children who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by what they want, she said, "Please be my mama." The kitchen went absolutely silent. Eliza looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at his daughter with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and pain, with something else underneath it that she suspected had more to do with her than with the child. "Clara," he said. His voice was even. "Why don't you go get your brother?" "He's upstairs." "I know where he is. Go get him." Clara released Eliza and headed for the stairs without argument, though she looked back once before disappearing around the corner. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment after she left. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, not looking directly at her. He moved to the stove and lifted the coffee pot. She has a lot of feelings about this arrangement. I've tried to explain that it isn't." "Please don't apologize for her," Eliza said. He looked at her then. "She's a child who wants a mother," Eliza said. That's not something that needs an apology. He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded once, set the coffee pot back down, and turned to open the stove door and add another piece of wood. Coffee? He said. Please. Chum. The boy came down the stairs like he was doing everyone a favor by showing up at all. He was older than Clara by what Eliza guessed was about 4 years, maybe 9 or 10, with his father's dark hair and the kind of watchful stillness that you see in children who've spent a long time paying close attention to things. He came into the kitchen, looked at Eliza, and then looked at his father with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, none of them warm. This is Eliza Rowan, Caleb said. Miss Rowan, this is my son, Thomas. Hello, Thomas, Eliza said. Thomas looked at her the way a doctor looks at a symptom he doesn't trust yet. Hello, he said, in a tone that was technically polite and practically nothing else. Clara appeared behind him, pushing past his elbow to reclaim her spot near Eliza. Thomas watched this with the resigned suffering of an older sibling who has long since given up on dignity. Caleb set a cup of coffee on the table and gestured to the chair nearest the stove. Sit down, Miss Rowan. There's stew from last night. It'll be warm in a few minutes. Eliza sat. The warmth of the mug against her hands was almost too much. Her fingers had been numb for so long that the heat was almost painful. She wrapped her hands around the ceramic and just held it. Thomas sat down across from her, still watching. Clara climbed onto the chair beside Eliza without asking and sat with her chin in her hand, studying Eliza's face with open fascination. Where did you come from? Clara asked. Ohio, originally, Eliza said. A town called Milford. Is that far? Very far. Did you have children in Ohio? The question landed softly, but it landed. Eliza kept her expression still. No, I was a school teacher. I taught other people's children. Did you have a husband? Clara. Caleb's voice was mild but unmistakable. Papa, I'm just asking. It's all right, Eliza said, and she meant it. She looked at Clara steadily. I did have a husband. His name was Robert. He died 3 years ago. Of what? Thomas asked. His father looked at him sharply. Thomas. It's a reasonable question, Thomas said unapologetically. Eliza looked at the boy. He was challenging her. She recognized it for what it was. Not cruelty, but a test. The kind that children administer when they've already been hurt and want to know ahead of time whether you're the kind of person who flinches. Fever, she said. There was an outbreak the winter of 1880. He was sick for about 2 weeks. I was with him at the end. Thomas held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but settling, like she'd passed some preliminary examination without knowing the criteria. Our mother died too, Clara said conversationally, as though these two facts belonged in the same category. I know, Eliza said. Your father told me in his letters. I'm very sorry. I was 3, Clara said. I don't really remember her. She said this without particular sadness. The way young children report facts about their lives before memory was fully operational. Then, with the complete non sequitur logic of a 6-year-old, do you know how to make biscuits? Eliza almost smiled. I do. Papa's biscuits are bad, Clara said. Clara, Caleb said. They are, Papa. They're like rocks. They keep you full, he said, which was exactly the wrong defense, and clearly he knew it from the face he made immediately after. Eliza did smile then, just barely. She looked down at her coffee to hide it. After the children were sent upstairs with the instruction to find something quiet to do, which in Thomas's case likely meant reading, and in Clara's case likely meant something considerably less quiet, Caleb and Eliza sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the remains of the stew between them and the particular awkwardness of 2 strangers who have been corresponding for 4 months and are now meeting for the first time in person. The letters had been honest. She knew that much about him already. Caleb Ashcroft did not seem to be a man who bothered with pretense. He'd written about the ranch with clear eyes, describing both what it was and what it demanded. He'd written about his children with a directness that she'd respected. Thomas is 9 and does not trust easily. Clara is 5 and trusts perhaps too easily. They both need more than I am able to give them on my own. And I find that I can admit that, which is something I could not have said a year ago. He'd written about his wife Margaret only once, and only briefly. She was the heart of this place. I did not know how much of the ranch's life came from her until she was gone. Eliza had folded that letter very carefully when she'd finished reading it and set it at the bottom of the stack. Now, he sat across from her, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. Large hands, rough from work, with a scar along the outside of the right one that she didn't ask about, and looking at her with an expression that was careful and direct at the same time. "The roads were bad," he said. It wasn't a question. "The roads were very bad," she said. "We lost 2 days to flooding outside of Laramie. Then the axle cracked on the wagon, and we spent a day and a half waiting for a repair." She paused. "Then I had a disagreement with the man driving the wagon about which route to take, and I was wrong about that, which cost us another day." She said this without editorializing, just stating it. He nodded. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "When you saw me step down from that wagon this afternoon," she stopped, choosing the words carefully. "I know I looked considerably less than what you were probably expecting. I want to know if that changes anything for you about this arrangement." She kept her voice neutral and her eyes on his face, because she'd had 11 days on that road to prepare herself for this conversation, and she intended to have it with some dignity. Caleb was quiet for a moment, long enough that she felt the tension of it. "You want to know if I'm going to send you back," he said. "I want to know where we stand." He set down his coffee mug, looked at her straight. "You got here," he said. "That road would have turned most people around after the first day, and you got here. So no, Miss Rowan, it doesn't change anything." She breathed out slowly. She hadn't quite realized how much she'd been bracing until she felt herself stop doing it. "All right," she said. "Then I'd like to know about the household. What needs doing first? What the children's schedule has been. What—" "It can wait until morning," he said. "You just spent 11 days getting here. Nothing on this ranch is so urgent it can't wait one night." She looked at him. It occurred to her that she had spent the better part of 3 years bracing for the next thing, the next problem, the next decision, the next way the world was going to require something from her that she wasn't sure she had left to give. And this man, this stranger she'd been writing letters to for 4 months, had just told her nothing was urgent. Like it was simple, like it was obvious. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in ways she couldn't explain without embarrassing herself. Her room was small. That was fine. She'd expected small. What she hadn't expected was the small things somebody had done to it. There was a quilt on the bed that was old but clean, its colors faded to soft golds and blues. On the windowsill there was a tin cup with 3 dried wildflowers in it. Someone had clearly put them there some time ago, because the flowers were long dead, but the attempt was evident. And on the small table beside the bed, someone had left a candle already lit, a small tin of salve, the kind used for chapped skin and minor cuts, and a folded piece of paper. Eliza picked up the paper. On it, in large, carefully formed letters that belonged unmistakably to a child still learning her handwriting, were the words, "Welcome, Elisa." The A and the E in welcome had been switched. There was a drawing beneath it, a figure with round eyes and yellow hair standing next to a taller figure with brown hair and what appeared to be a very large smile. Both figures had their arms stretched out at their sides in the universal child's representation of joy. Eliza sat down on the edge of the bed and held the piece of paper for a moment. She had made herself very practical about this arrangement. She'd had to. After Robert died and the schoolhouse in Milford had reduced her position and the house she'd rented had become too expensive, and her options had narrowed to a point she couldn't look at directly, she'd had to stop feeling things in a certain way and start making decisions instead. The advertisement in the Gazette had been a decision. The letters to Caleb Ashcroft had been a series of decisions. Getting on the train had been a decision. She had not made room in any of those decisions for the possibility that a 6-year-old child might leave a misspelled welcome note and dried wildflowers for a woman she'd never met. Eliza set the note down carefully on the table and pressed the heel of her hand to her eye for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened up, took a breath, and began the slow business of getting out of her wet clothes. She woke before dawn. It was a habit from the schoolhouse years, rising before the world was fully lit, and she found she couldn't shake it even when she would have benefited from sleeping longer. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar bed, in the unfamiliar dark, and listened to the sound of the ranch. Wind against the window glass, something moving in the barn, the deep silence that lies under everything in open country, a silence with weight to it, nothing like the silence of a town. She got up. The kitchen was cold. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. She stirred it back to life with the poker, added 2 pieces of wood from the box beside the hearth, and then stood there watching the flame build because she had nothing else to do yet, and the warmth was still something she hadn't taken for granted. There was flour, lard, buttermilk, or close enough to it, a little salt. She made biscuits. She wasn't particularly sentimental about cooking. It was a skill she'd developed out of necessity, the same as most things. But she was good at it, and she'd learned that biscuits were the kind of thing that communicated competence in a way that actually mattered out here. Not a luxury, a utility. You could start a morning right with good biscuits, and starting things right was something she believed in. She had a pan in the oven by the time she heard the stairs creak. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her braids from the day before thoroughly dismantled, looking at Eliza with an expression of pure delight. "You're awake," the child said, as though this were remarkable. "I am. So are you." "I smelled something. Biscuits. They won't be ready for another 20 minutes. You should probably go back to bed." Clara came into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair at the table and looked at Eliza with clear intention of going nowhere. "I can wait," she said. Eliza looked at her. She had her father's coloring. The dark eyes were Caleb's, she realized now. Only where his were guarded, Clara's were simply open, like a door left wide because it hadn't occurred to anyone to close it yet. "Can I help?" Clara asked. "Do you know how to set a table?" "Yes." "Then yes, you can help." Clara slid off the chair and went to the cabinet with the purposeful air of someone who has been given a real job and intends to do it seriously. She was reaching for the plates, on her tiptoes, straining, when Eliza stepped up beside her and lifted them down without comment. "Thank you," Clara said formally. "You're welcome." They worked in a companionable quiet for several minutes, the child setting plates and cups with extreme care while Eliza checked the biscuits and put coffee on. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten in the east, going from black to a dark gray that promised morning without committing to it yet. "Miss Rowan?" Clara said. "Yes?" "Are you going to stay?" Eliza looked at the child. She was standing at the table with a fork in each hand, watching Eliza with that particular focused attention that children employ when they are asking the question they actually want answered. "That's the plan," Eliza said carefully. "Thomas says people don't always stay even when they say they're going to." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Thomas isn't wrong about that," she said. "People do sometimes leave when they've said they'd stay." She turned back to the stove. "I don't plan to be one of those people." "How do I know?" Clara said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Eliza turned to look at her again. This small girl in her nightgown, holding a fork in each hand, asking one of the only questions that actually matters about another human being. "You probably can't know for certain," Eliza said. "Not yet. You'll have to watch and decide for yourself." She paused. "That's what Thomas is doing." Clara considered this. Then she went back to placing forks with great deliberateness. "I already decided," she said matter-of-factly. Eliza turned back to the stove before the child could see her face. "Tut." Caleb came down at first light and stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he'd stopped in the yard the day before, registering something unexpected and taking a moment to reckon with it. His daughter was at the table, eating a biscuit with both hands and describing something at great length and speed. Across from her, Eliza Rowan sat with a coffee cup, listening with what appeared to be genuine attention. She'd changed into dry clothes, a gray dress, plain, practical, and she'd done something with her hair that made her look less like someone the storm had finished with and more like herself, whoever that was. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and coffee. It smelled, in some way he couldn't have articulated, like a morning was supposed to smell. He must have made some sound because Eliza looked up. Clara turned around. "Papa, Miss Rowan made biscuits and they're not like rocks at all." "That's a low bar," Eliza said, and he caught the edge of dry humor in it and felt something in his chest shift slightly, some small tightening loosen. "She let me help," Clara reported. "Did she?" He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee, trying to be easy about all of this, about the fact that there was someone standing in his kitchen at first light, and somehow it didn't feel wrong. "Where's your brother?" "Still sleeping. He's lazy." "He's not lazy. He's 12. Wait, no, he's 9. He's just not a morning person." He's grumpy in the mornings, Clara clarified for Eliza's benefit. That's different from lazy, Caleb agreed. He sat down at the table and reached for a biscuit. He bit into it. Didn't say anything. Well, Clara said. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him with that same careful, neutral expression she seemed to keep in reserve, waiting to see what he would do, he thought. What he would say. These are considerably better than rocks, he said. That is still a very low bar, Eliza said. He almost smiled. They're good, he said, straightforwardly. Thank you, Miss Rowan. You're welcome, Mr. Ashcroft. They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable exactly, but carries the weight of everything that hasn't been said yet. All the arrangements and understandings and adjustments that two strangers have to make when they've agreed to share a life and are only just beginning to understand what that means. Thomas came down at 6:30, took one look at Eliza, took one look at the biscuits, and sat down at the table with an expression that was not warmth, exactly, but was at least the absence of overt hostility, which, for Thomas, Eliza was beginning to understand, was its own kind of progress. He reached for a biscuit. Good morning, Thomas, Eliza said. Morning, he said into his biscuit. Clara looked at her brother with the superior expression of someone who has already made up their mind and is watching everyone else catch up. So, the first week was the hardest, though not in the way Eliza had anticipated. She'd expected the physical difficulty. The early mornings, the heavy work, the way a ranch demanded your body in ways that were entirely different from standing in front of a classroom. She'd known about that going in, or thought she had. What she hadn't fully reckoned with was the texture of integration, not just working alongside people, but learning the particular rhythms and habits of a household that had been running without her for 18 months and had developed, in that time, its own compensating patterns. Caleb rose at 4:30. He was out the door before it was fully light, and he came in for breakfast and then went back out, and he worked until it was dark, and sometimes past it. He was not unfriendly, but he was contained in the way of a person who has learned to rely on himself and hasn't quite worked out how to stop. Thomas watched her, constantly. She was aware of his eyes on her when she was doing anything domestic, cooking, cleaning, mending, tracking what she did and how she did it with the same careful attention he gave to everything. She didn't find this threatening. She found it honest. He was taking inventory. She could respect that. Clara, for her part, had apparently decided in the kitchen that first morning that the matter was settled, and she had thrown herself into Eliza's company with a wholehearted enthusiasm that was at turns delightful and overwhelming. She followed Eliza from room to room. She narrated everything she did. She asked approximately 40 questions per hour on subjects ranging from geography to what color dress Eliza would wear, if she could have any dress at all, to whether rabbits got lonely, to whether Ohio was near the ocean. No, Eliza told her on that last one. Ohio is nowhere near the ocean. Have you seen the ocean? Once, when I was young. Was it big? Enormous. More water than you can imagine. Clara chewed on this with the expression of someone trying to imagine exactly that. Bigger than our pond. Considerably bigger than your pond. Clara was quiet for a moment. Bigger than Wyoming. Eliza considered how to answer that. It's a different kind of big, she said finally. Wyoming is wide. The ocean is deep. They're not really the same kind of big. This apparently satisfied something because Clara nodded and moved on to her next question, which was about whether fish slept. It was Thomas who first let her in, and he did it sideways without acknowledging that he was doing it. On the 5th day, she found him in the barn after school hours, sitting in a patch of late afternoon light with a book on his lap, a pencil in his hand, and a look of concentrated frustration on his face. He didn't acknowledge her when she came in. She got what she'd come for, a bridle that needed mending, and was heading back out when he spoke. This doesn't make sense, he said, not to her specifically, to the air in front of him. She stopped. What doesn't? Long division. He said it like it was a personal enemy. I keep getting different answers. She set the bridle on the fence rail. Can I see? He looked at her. The calculation she'd seen in his face on the first day ran again, brief and quick. Then he held out the book. She looked at the problem. He was carrying wrong, a small, consistent error that was cascading through the rest of it. Here, she said, pointing. You're carrying the remainder to the wrong column. When you divide the hundreds, the remainder goes to the tens, not straight across to the ones. He looked at it. That doesn't... He stopped. Did it again in his head. His face changed slightly. Oh. Try it again. He did. Got the right answer. Looked at it for a moment. I've been doing it wrong for 2 weeks, he said. Well, Eliza said, picking up the bridle again, now you know. She was almost to the barn door when he said, without looking up from his book, Miss Rowan. Yes? A pause. Not long, but deliberate. The stew you made last night was good. Eliza looked at the back of his head for a moment. Thank you, Thomas, she said. She walked back toward the house with the bridle over her arm and the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the yard. And she didn't let herself think too hard about what it meant that 9-year-old Thomas Ashcroft had just said something nice to her. She just filed it away carefully, in the place where she kept the things that mattered. On the 7th evening after the children were in bed, Caleb sat down across from her at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and said, without preamble, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. She set down her mending. All right, why did you come? He was watching her with those careful dark eyes. Not the general answer, not because the advertisement was practical or because the situation suited your circumstances. Why here? Why me? He paused. I know what my letter said, and I know what yours said, but I've been thinking about it all week, and I keep coming back to the question. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She'd known this question was coming. She'd have asked it herself if she were in his position. But she hadn't decided how much of the true answer she was going to give. She decided on the true answer. Your letter, she said. The first one. You wrote that you were a man who had loved someone very much and lost her, and that you weren't looking for a replacement. You were looking for a partner, and you meant it. I could tell you meant it because of the way you put it. She looked down at her hands. A lot of the advertisements I read were, she searched for the right word. Transactional. They needed a cook. They needed someone to look after children. Which is honest, but it's not enough, he said. No, it's not. She looked up at him. You wrote that you had 2 children who were still grieving and a ranch that was too big for one person, and that you were not under any illusion that what you were proposing was simple. You wrote that if a woman was willing to come out here and put in the work, you would give her every consideration and respect you had. She paused. That was what I needed to hear. Not a promise of romance. Not a guarantee. Just an honest assessment and a fair deal. He was quiet for a moment. You'd had enough of things that weren't honest. She looked at him. He'd intuited it from just that, and he'd said it without pressing. She nodded. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. Margaret was a person who made everything better by being in it, he said. His voice was even, but not easy. I don't say that to... He stopped. I'm not going to pretend she didn't exist, or that I don't still... He stopped again, and there was something in his face that she recognized, because she'd felt it herself. The difficulty of talking about loss without making it into something it isn't, without dressing it up or stripping it bare. I know, she said. You don't have to explain that. He looked at her. Robert was my whole life for 7 years, she said. I'm not going to pretend he wasn't. He's part of why I am the way I am, and that's just true. It doesn't have to be a problem. She paused. Unless we make it one. Something in Caleb's expression settled. Not relaxed. He wasn't a man who relaxed easily, she was already learning that, but settled, like a thing finding its right position. All right, he said. All right, she said. They drank their coffee in a silence that was, for the first time since she'd arrived, something close to companionable. Outside, the wind had picked up across the Wyoming plain, rattling the window glass and moving through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. It was a hard country. She'd known that. She had not known, quite, that it could also be beautiful in the way that difficult things sometimes are. All that empty space, all that sky, the way a ranch fire in the distance looked like something left over from the world's beginning. She didn't say any of this to Caleb. Some observations you keep for yourself, at least at first. She just wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and watched the window and thought that this was probably a place a person could build something, if they were willing to do the work. She had always been willing to do the work. She picked up her mending and went back to it, And across the table, Caleb drank his coffee and said nothing more. And the kitchen held them both in its warmth while the wind moved through the dark outside, carrying the smell of rain and distance and the particular wildness of the frontier country that would either break you or make you into something stronger than you knew you were. Eliza Rowan had been broken before. She did not intend to be broken again. The second week was when Eliza understood what she had actually signed up for, not the work. She'd known about the work, had prepared herself for it in the abstract way you prepare for something you've read about but never lived. What she hadn't prepared for was the particular loneliness of being present in a place where you don't yet belong. She was there, physically, in the house and the yard and the kitchen, moving through the days with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back, doing the things that needed doing. But there was a version of belonging that had nothing to do with proximity, and she didn't have that yet, and she was honest enough with herself to feel the difference. The ranch was called the Ashcroft Place by everyone in the surrounding county, which was the kind of designation that told you everything about the land's relationship to the family. It ran about 400 acres of mixed grass and timber, with a creek that cut through the eastern third and a ridge to the north that blocked the worst of the winter wind. Caleb ran cattle, not many, about 60 head going into fall, and a small number of horses that he bred and sold when the market was right. He did most of the work himself, with occasional help from a neighbor's son named Pete, who was 16 and mostly reliable. Eliza learned all of this gradually, the way you learn things about a place you're living in rather than visiting. Not from being told, but from paying attention. She learned that the creek flooded its banks twice a year, spring and late fall, and that the low fence along the eastern pasture needed to be checked after every rain because the posts had been sinking for 3 years, and nobody had gotten around to resetting them. She learned that the barn cat, a gray tom with half an ear missing, would only accept food from a certain tin dish and would ignore anything placed in a different vessel. She learned that Thomas did his homework at the kitchen table immediately after supper and became unreachable during that time, and that Clara needed someone to check under her bed before she would sleep because she had seen a mouse there once in April and had not recovered from the experience. She learned these things because she was watching, because watching was what you did when you were new to a place and smart enough to know that the fastest way to understand a household was to stop trying to change it before you understood it. The neighbors came on the 11th day. There were 3 women arriving together in a buckboard with a basket of preserves and the unmistakable air of people conducting a social call that is also, transparently, an inspection. Their names were Ruth Halverson, the one who had convinced Caleb to place the advertisement in the first place, Martha Greer, and a younger woman named Josephine Pratt, who was maybe 25 and had the kind of bright, observant eyes that missed very little. Eliza received them in the kitchen because that was the appropriate room and because the parlor, such as it was, had a broken window latch that let cold air in at the corner, and she hadn't yet found the right moment to ask Caleb about fixing it. She made coffee and set out the tin of molasses cookies she'd made the day before, and she sat across from 3 women who were looking at her with various degrees of curiosity and judgment, and in Ruth Halverson's case, something that might eventually become goodwill if given sufficient time and evidence. Ruth was about 50, solid and direct, with gray-streaked hair and the no-nonsense manner of a woman who had survived hard decades on the frontier by eliminating everything unnecessary from her life, including excessive politeness. She looked at Eliza the way she probably looked at horses she was considering buying, assessing weight, condition, likelihood of lasting the winter. "You're younger than I expected," Ruth said, which was not quite a compliment. "I'm 31, Eliza said. The last one was 38. There was a brief, pointed silence. Eliza looked at Ruth steadily. "I wasn't aware there had been a previous arrangement." "There wasn't," Ruth said. She came out, took one look at the situation, and went back on the next available wagon. She said this without apparent malice, just reporting a fact. The situation being 2 children, 40 miles from the nearest town, and a man who works from dark to dark and doesn't say more than necessary. "Ruth," Josephine said mildly. "I'm not saying anything that isn't true," Ruth said. She was still looking at Eliza. "I'm saying it because you ought to know what you're dealing with, and also because I want to see if you're the kind of woman who flinches when she hears something she doesn't like." Eliza set down her coffee cup. "Did she leave before or after she met the children?" "Before," Ruth said. "Didn't even get as far as the house." Then we're already ahead of where she was, Eliza said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she reached for a molasses cookie. Fair enough, she said. Martha Greer was a softer presence, rounder, warmer, a mother of 5 who looked at Eliza with the sympathetic eyes of someone who understands domestic difficulty from the inside. She asked sensible questions about where Eliza had taught school and how she was finding the climate and whether she needed anything from town on their next trip in. The questions were friendly, and they were also, Eliza understood, a form of triangulation. Martha was building a picture, and the picture she was building would eventually circulate through the community and become the way people understood what Caleb Ashcroft had brought to his ranch. Josephine Pratt said very little during the visit, but when the other 2 women were putting on their coats and Ruth was saying her goodbyes, with the blunt warmth of someone who's decided provisionally in your favor, Josephine paused at the door and turned back. The children? She said quietly. How are they doing? Truly. Eliza looked at her. There was something in the question that was not idle curiosity, something personal. Thomas is careful, Eliza said. Clara is Clara. She paused. They're both trying, in their own ways. Josephine nodded. She had something in her face that looked like she was going to say more, and then decided against it. Margaret was my friend, she said instead, simply. Clara looks exactly like her. She said it without challenge, just information, something she needed Eliza to know. I can see that, Eliza said, and she meant it as acknowledgement, not competition. Josephine studied her for a moment. Then she nodded again and went out the door. After they'd gone, Eliza stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular quiet of a house after visitors leave, and she thought about Margaret Ashcroft, who had been a living person with a friend named Josephine who still grieved her, who had raised 2 children in this kitchen, who had been the heart of this place in ways that were still visible if you knew how to look. In the way Caleb sometimes went still and distant for no apparent reason, in the way Thomas kept a photograph face down on his dresser that he never looked at in front of her, in the way Clara sometimes called out in the night for someone who wasn't there. Eliza was not here to replace Margaret Ashcroft. She'd been clear about that with herself from the beginning. But she was here, and Margaret was not. And the space between those 2 facts was something she was going to have to learn to inhabit without either dismissing it or drowning in it. She poured the remaining coffee down the drain and went back to work. The work itself was what saved her, in the practical sense. There was enough of it that she couldn't afford to spend too much time inside her own head. The household had been running on survival mode for a long time, Caleb managing the ranch and the cooking and the children's basic needs with a focused efficiency that kept everything functional, but nothing more than that. There were meals to be planned and made. There were clothes that needed mending, some of them past mending, which meant new ones needed to be cut and sewn. There was a winter's worth of preparation that hadn't been started, vegetables that needed to be put up, supplies that needed to be inventoried, gaps in the larder that needed to be addressed before the real cold came. She made a list on her 3rd morning and showed it to Caleb over breakfast, and he looked at it with an expression that was partly practical assessment and partly something else, something like recognition, like he was seeing the scope of what had been going undone and was not entirely comfortable with it. I should have gotten to some of this, he said. You were managing, she said. That's different from not caring. He looked at her briefly. Some of this will need a trip to town, for supplies. I know. I can make do with what's here for another week, but after that we'll need flour, salt, more lard, sugar. She paused. Clara needs new boots. The ones she has are a full size too small. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Not at her. She understood that. At himself. I hadn't noticed. She didn't say anything, Eliza said. Children often don't. They just adjust until they can't anymore. She folded the list. It's not a failing, Mr. Ashcroft. You can't notice everything when you're the only one looking. He was quiet for a moment. Caleb, he said. She looked at him. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. Caleb is fine. She folded the list and slid it into her apron pocket. Caleb, she said, trying it out. He nodded and picked up his coffee, and that was that. The incident with the storm happened on the 19th day. It came out of the north in the early afternoon, one of those late-season weather systems that behaved more like winter than fall, moving fast and dropping temperature ahead of it like a warning. Caleb had been out on the south pasture since morning, and Pete had gone home sick the day before. And by the time Eliza saw the clouds building on the horizon and understood what they meant, she had about an hour to make decisions. She made them quickly. Thomas was at the kitchen table doing schoolwork when she came in from the yard. Clara was upstairs. Eliza went to the bottom of the staircase. "Clara, come down and put your coat on." "Why?" came the voice from above. "Because I'm asking you to." Clara appeared at the top of the stairs with an expression that suggested this was not a sufficient reason. "But I'm playing." "You can play after. Come down, please." Something in Eliza's voice must have communicated that this was not a moment for negotiation, because Clara came down without further argument, which was not her usual pattern. Eliza turned to Thomas. "I need your help." He looked up from his book. He read her face the same way he read everything, quickly and carefully. "Storm?" he said, "coming fast. I need to get the animals into the barn, and I don't know where everything is yet. You do." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, already reaching for his coat. She noticed that, filed it away. When something real was happening, Thomas did not hesitate. They worked for 40 minutes in a rising wind, Thomas directing and Eliza moving, the two of them finding a working rhythm that surprised her a little. The boy knew the ranch the way he knew his arithmetic, thoroughly, from a position of having paid close attention for a long time. He knew which horses spooked in weather and needed to be handled quietly. Knew that the barn door on the east side had a tendency to swing shut if you didn't prop it correctly. Knew that the 3 calves in the north pen needed to be moved first because they were the most vulnerable. Clara stayed inside as instructed, which cost her something in dignity, but which she managed with the stoic pragmatism of a child who understood, at some level, the difference between being included and being underfoot. By the time Caleb rode in from the south pasture, pushing hard, the horses' sides heaving, the animals were secured, the water barrels had been moved under the barn overhang, and Eliza was in the process of pulling the storm shutters across the kitchen windows. He swung down from the saddle and looked at the yard, at the closed barn, at the shutters going across the windows. He stood there for a second, and then looked at her. "Thomas helped," she said. "He knew where everything was." Caleb looked at his son, who was tying off the last barn door. Something passed across his face, something proud and a little undone at the same time, the particular expression of a parent who has just seen their child be capable in a way that catches them off guard. He turned back to Eliza. "The chickens?" he said. "In the barn." "The water barrels?" "Under the overhang." "The calves in the north pen, they need to be—" "They're already inside," Thomas said, coming across the yard. His hair was plastered to his face from the wind. He looked at his father with a carefully neutral expression that did not quite conceal the fact that he was aware he had done a good thing. Caleb put a hand on the back of his son's neck, briefly, just for a moment. Thomas didn't pull away. "Go inside," Caleb said, "both of you." The storm hit an hour later with full fury, driving sleet and wind that rattled the whole house in a way that made the walls feel thin and provisional. They ate supper huddled around the stove, the 4 of them, closer than they'd yet been at a table, and Clara narrated her own brave suffering at being confined to the house during the preparation in tones of considerable self-pity that made Thomas roll his eyes so hard it looked like it might cause him physical pain. "You were very sensible to stay inside," Eliza said, which she meant, and which Clara received with the graciousness of someone accepting their due. "Thomas got to go out, though," Clara pointed out. "Thomas is 9, Eliza said. "When you're 9, we'll discuss it." Clara absorbed this with the expression of someone doing arithmetic on how many years 9 was away. The answer apparently did not please her, but she accepted it. After supper, Caleb sat across from Eliza at the table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and said quietly, so the children in the next room couldn't hear, "Thank you." "Thomas did most of it," she said. "Thomas knew where things were because of what I taught him. He did what he did because of what you asked him to." He looked at her steadily. "That's different from nothing." She had been about to deflect again, and something in his directness stopped her. She nodded. "You're welcome." He picked up his coffee, drank it cold without making a face about it, set it down again. "You've been here nearly 3 weeks, he said. 19 days. He looked at her. "How are you finding it? Honestly." She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Harder than I expected in some ways, she said. Different in others. She paused. The isolation takes some adjusting to. I knew it would be remote. Knowing and experiencing are not always the same. The community isn't much, he said. It wasn't an apology, just information. Ruth Halverson came by last week, Eliza said, with Martha Greer and Josephine Pratt. He looked up. How did that go? Ruth was forthright. That's a charitable way to put it. I appreciated it. I'd rather know what people actually think. She paused. She told me about the woman who came before, the one who left before she reached the house. He was quiet for a moment, a long moment. That was 8 months ago, he said. I should have told you about it. Yes, Eliza said. You should have. He looked at her. The acknowledgement of the omission sat between them, not accusatory, just present. I thought if I mentioned it, you might decide against coming, he said. You were probably right, she said, and I also think that was the wrong calculation. She said it without heat. If I'm going to be here, I need to know the full picture, not a partial one. He nodded, slow but real. Fair, he said. Josephine Pratt told me Margaret was her friend, Eliza said. She watched his face when she said it, watched it do the small, controlled thing it did when Margaret's name came up, a kind of interior bracing that was nearly invisible unless you were paying attention. I thought you should know that I know that. He looked down at his coffee cup. Josephine she's had a hard time with it. Margaret and she were close. It showed, Eliza said. In a good way. She paused. She loves your children. You can see it. She checks on them, Caleb said. More than most. He was quiet for a moment. It's not always easy, having people around who knew Margaret, who look at the kids and see her. Does it bother you that I don't? He looked up. The question had been more direct than she'd intended, but she left it out there. Sometimes, he said after a moment, honest. Sometimes it's easier. She nodded. That made sense. She didn't press it. Clara appeared in the doorway then, in her nightgown, her hair undone, holding her pillow like a shield. There's a sound, she announced. What kind of sound? Caleb said. A scary one. It's the storm, Clara. I know that, she said, with great dignity. I still don't like it. Caleb started to get up. Eliza put a hand on his arm, barely, just a light touch, and he stopped. She looked at him briefly, a question in it. He settled back. Eliza pushed back her chair. Come on, she said to Clara. Where? Back to bed. I'll sit with you until you fall asleep. You don't have to do that, Clara said, in the tone of someone who very much hopes you will. I know I don't, Eliza said. Come on. She followed Clara up the stairs and into the small bedroom with its quilt of faded blues, and she sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark while the storm pressed against the house from all sides. Clara lay with her eyes wide open for approximately 30 seconds before deciding that the situation required more than lying there. Tell me something, she said. About what? Anything. A story. Eliza thought for a moment. When I was about your age, she said, we had a storm like this one. Bigger, even. And I was so frightened that I went and sat in the pantry because it was the room with no windows. Were you alone? No, my mother came and found me. She brought a candle and we sat in the pantry together until it passed. She paused. It took most of the night. Clara considered this. Did she tell you stories? She told me about her mother and her mother's mother. All the women in our family going back. She paused. She said every one of them had survived something hard, and I came from every one of them, so the capacity for surviving was in my blood already. I just had to remember to use it. The wind pressed against the window. The house shook once, settled. Do you think I have that? Clara asked. That capacity? Eliza looked at her in the dark. At this small girl who had lost her mother at 3 and was 6 years old and asking one of the most important questions a person could ask about themselves. I know you do, Eliza said. I've watched you. Clara was quiet. How can you tell? Because every single morning you wake up and you go straight into the day, Eliza said. You don't sit around waiting to feel ready. You just start. Paused. That's not nothing, Clara. That's actually quite a lot. The silence after that was softer. 10 minutes later, maybe 15, Claire's breathing had gone even and slow. Eliza sat on the edge of the mattress for another moment in the particular quiet of a sleeping child, and she thought about her mother in the pantry with a candle, and about her own capacity for surviving, and about the fact that she was sitting on the edge of a bed in Wyoming, in a house that was not yet home, but was beginning, just barely, around the edges, to feel like it might become one. She went back downstairs. Thomas was still at the kitchen table. He'd moved on from his arithmetic to what looked like a geography primer, and he had the focused, slightly resentful look of a person who doesn't want to admit they're finding something interesting. He glanced up when she came in and then back down at his book. She poured herself the last of the coffee, which was barely warm, sat down. "She asleep?" Thomas asked, without looking up. "Yes." He turned a page. The storm moved against the house. Somewhere in the walls, something creaked and settled. "She gets scared in storms," Thomas said. "She always has, since she was little. She told me she knew it was just the storm." "She always knows," Thomas said. "It doesn't help." He turned another page. "I used to tell her things. When she was gone. I used to go sit in her room when it stormed." He said it without sentimentality, just reporting, but it was the first time he had volunteered anything about Margaret to her directly, and she understood the weight of it, not the information itself, but the offering. "That was good of you," she said. "She's my sister," he said, as if this were a complete explanation, which, in its way, it was. They sat in silence for a while, the storm outside, the coffee growing cold, the lamp between them throwing its small yellow circle. "Miss Rowan," Thomas said. "Yes." He kept his eyes on his book. "You did good today, with the storm preparation." She waited. He turned a page, though she didn't think he'd actually read it. "I didn't think you'd know what to do. We've had women come before who didn't." He paused. "They left." "I heard," she said. "I just thought you should know that you—" He stopped, started again. "It wasn't bad, what you did." From Thomas Ashcroft, who trusted slowly and said less than he meant and watched everything from behind a careful distance. This was not a small thing. Eliza knew that. She received it accordingly. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "That means something to me." He nodded sharply, once, and went back to his geography primer. The conversation was over by his terms, which she respected. Caleb had moved from the table to the chair by the stove, and he had his eyes closed, though she didn't think he was sleeping. He looked, in the firelight, like a man who is tired in the way that goes below the surface of the body, tired in some place that sleep didn't always reach. She thought about the first day, standing in the rain in front of his door, bracing herself to be told to go back the way she came. She thought about the way he'd simply stepped aside and held the door open, without a word, without ceremony, like welcoming in a person who was soaking wet and covered in road was just a thing you did because it was obvious. She thought, this is a man who has been alone with his grief for a very long time, and he is trying, in his contained and careful way, to let the walls down far enough to let someone in. And he doesn't entirely know how to do it yet, and neither does she. And that is probably the most honest thing she can say about where they stand. The storm blew itself out sometime around midnight. By morning, it was gone, leaving the yard covered in a thin glaze of sleet that caught the early light and turned the whole world silver and sharp. Eliza was up before anyone else. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the glazed yard and the barn and the ridge to the north that had kept the worst of the wind off the house. And she thought about 19 days and about what 19 more might bring. And then she stopped thinking and started making breakfast because that was what the morning asked for. And she had learned, over the hard years, to answer what the morning asked. The glazed yard melted by mid-morning, and by afternoon the ranch looked like itself again, muddy and wind-scoured and relentlessly ordinary. Life resumed. That was the thing about hard weather out here, Eliza was learning. It came, it pressed, it passed, and then the land simply absorbed it and went on. There was no recovery period. The cattle still needed feeding the morning after a storm. The fire still needed wood. The children still needed breakfast. She had been at the Ashcroft Ranch for 6 weeks when she began to understand that the danger was not going to come from outside. The danger was going to come from the fact that she was starting to care about this place. Not in the abstract way she'd cared about it when it was an idea in letters. A practical arrangement, a reasonable solution to the problem of her circumstances. But in the specific, particular way that comes from knowing where the barn cat liked to sleep in cold mornings, and which floorboard on the staircase third from the top would wake the whole house if you stepped on it wrong, and the exact way Caleb's voice changed when he was genuinely amused versus when he was being polite about something. She noticed that last one, and noticing it made her careful. She had not come here for sentiment. She had come here because she was a woman of 31 with a dead husband and a narrowing set of options, and she had made a practical decision, and she intended to honor it practically. The fact that Thomas now sometimes sat at the kitchen table while she cooked without any particular reason to be there other than company was not something she was going to attach significance to. The fact that Clara had started saying Miss Eliza instead of Miss Rowan with a familiarity that suggested the gap between formal and something else was closing. She noted it and moved on. The fact that Caleb, 2 nights after the storm, had come into the kitchen at 9:30 and found her still awake at the table with her mending, and had sat down across from her without saying anything and stayed there for the better part of an hour. That one she filed away very carefully, in the place she didn't visit too often. It was Ruth Halverson who named it, because Ruth Halverson named things whether or not you wanted her to. She came alone the second time, a week after the storm, ostensibly to return a pot she'd borrowed from the Ashcroft kitchen some time before Margaret died, and had only now remembered to give back. She came in, set the pot on the counter, accepted coffee, and sat down at the table with the air of someone who intends to stay until they've said what they came to say. "You're settling in," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Trying to," Eliza said. "The children look better than they did a month ago." Ruth wrapped her hands around the mug. "Claire's boots actually fit her now. Thomas looks like someone's been making sure he eats." "He forgets," Eliza said. "If you don't put something in front of him when he's reading, he'll skip a meal entirely and not notice until he falls over." Ruth looked at her. "You figured that out already?" "It wasn't hard to figure out." "No," Ruth said, "but it requires paying attention." She paused. "How's Caleb?" Eliza looked at her steadily. "You'd have to ask Caleb." "I'm asking you." "Then I'd say he works too hard and sleeps too little and doesn't ask for help with things when he needs it." She paused. "But I think you know that already." Ruth nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, running her thumb along the edge of the mug. Then, "He was not doing well before you came. I want you to understand that. I don't say it to alarm you. I say it because you should know the full picture." "He told me the situation in his letters," Eliza said carefully. "He told you the practical situation. 2 children, working ranch, needs a capable woman." Ruth looked at her directly. "He didn't tell you that he'd been walking around for 18 months like a man who doesn't quite believe he's still supposed to be here, working himself half to death every day and calling it necessity." She paused. "I've known Caleb Ashcroft for 15 years. I know the difference between a man who works hard and a man who works so he doesn't have to think." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Claire's voice drifted in from the yard, where she was attempting to convince the barn cat to wear a doll's bonnet, a project that was audibly not going well. "I don't know what you want me to do with that information," Eliza said, carefully, honestly. "I don't want you to do anything with it," Ruth said. "I just want you to know it." She picked up her coffee. "Because whatever's happening in this house right now, whatever changes you've made and however the children are warming up to you, none of that will hold if Caleb doesn't let himself be part of it." She looked at Eliza. "And I don't know if he knows how to do that yet. I don't know if anyone showed him that it's allowed." Eliza sat with that for a moment. "I'm not his—" she started. "No," Ruth agreed, "you're not. I'm not suggesting you fix him. I'm saying watch for it." She set the mug down and stood up. "You're smarter than the last 3 people he might have considered, and the children already have feelings about you that are going to matter a great deal. Just watch for it." After she left, Eliza washed the coffee cups and thought about watching for things. The following week, Caleb's horse threw a shoe on the north ridge and came up lame, and Caleb walked the animal back to the barn in the last of the afternoon light and came in for supper with his jaw set in that particular way that meant something had gone wrong, and he was managing it internally. He didn't say what it was at supper. He answered Clara's questions about whether horses dreamed with a patience that was genuine if slightly strained, and he ate what was put in front of him, and he thanked Eliza for it, and he went back out to check on the horse after the children were in bed. She was still up when he came in from the barn, later than she'd expected, He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked slightly surprised to see her. "You don't have to wait up," he said. "I wasn't waiting," she said. "I was reading." This was not entirely true, but the book was open. He came in and sat down. Didn't reach for anything. Not coffee, not food. Just sat with his hands on the table in front of him, and she could see the tiredness in him. Not the physical kind that sleep fixes, but the other kind, the one Ruth had been describing. "How's the horse?" she asked. "She'll be all right. Need to keep her off the north pasture for a week, which means I'll have to move the fence line on the east section to expand the grazing area, which means I need Pete, and Pete's family has their harvest to get in, so that probably puts me at 2 weeks before I can—" He stopped, let out a breath through his nose. "It's a manageable problem." "It sounds manageable," she agreed. "I have a list," he said, with a kind of dark humor. "The manageable problems are on one side. The ones I haven't figured out yet are on the other." "Which side is longer?" He looked at her. Something in the question had been lighter than she intended, and she saw him register that she was making a small, careful space for something besides weight. "Currently, they're about even," he said. "That's better than it was?" she guessed. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. 6 weeks ago, the second list was considerably longer." She nodded and looked down at her book and didn't make anything of that, didn't point to herself as a reason, didn't extract credit, just let it be a fact that sat quietly between them. He stayed at the table. She read, or appeared to. The stove ticked as the fire settled. Outside, the stars were doing what Wyoming stars did on clear nights, which was exist with an extravagance that still startled her sometimes. More stars than she'd ever seen in Ohio. The sky out here so dark and so wide that on nights like this, it felt less like looking up and more like falling in. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said. "Yes, your husband." He said it carefully, not quite meeting her eyes. "Robert, what was he like?" She looked up. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first personal question he'd asked her that wasn't about practicalities. She thought about Robert, the way she'd learned to think about him in the years since. Not the end, not the fever, but the before. The man who had read novels aloud in the evenings, who had laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, who had been constitutionally unable to let a stray animal pass without stopping to assess whether it needed something. "Kind," she said. "Genuinely kind. Not the kind of kind that people perform, the kind that's just in how a person moves through the world." She paused. He was also impractical about money. We were always a few months behind on something because he couldn't pass a person in difficulty without emptying his pockets. She said it with the affectionate exasperation of someone who has had years to arrive at the balance between grief and honesty. I used to be frustrated by it. Now I think it was probably the best thing about him. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long were you married?" 7 years. "Were you happy?" The question was plain and serious, and she answered it the same way. "Yes. Not every day. Nobody's happy every day. But yes, we were happy." He nodded, looking at the table, something working in his face that she had learned to wait out rather than push. "Margaret and I fought about stupid things," he said, "more than I want to admit. The kind of arguments that don't matter and feel enormous at the time." He paused. "After she died, those were the ones that stayed with me. The arguments. Not because they were important, but because they're what I had energy for when I shouldn't have." Eliza looked at him. "I spent a long time thinking about the last few months," he said. "Whether I'd said enough. Whether she knew." He stopped. "That's probably more than you needed to hear." "It isn't," she said, quietly but clearly. He looked at her then, really at her, in the direct way he had that was still not entirely comfortable for either of them. Still carried the faint charge of two people who have not yet worked out all the terms of being honest with each other. "She knew," Eliza said. "People know. The day-to-day is what tells them, not the declarations." He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded. Not the quick, decisive nod of someone dismissing a topic, but something slower and more considered. "You should sleep," she said. "The fence line will still be there tomorrow." "Yeah." He pushed back from the table, stood. "Good night, Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss. She wasn't sure he'd noticed he'd done it. "Good night," she said. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a letter. It came on a Thursday in the 6th week, with the supply wagon from Lander tucked in among a package of thread and 2 pounds of coffee and a copy of a newspaper 2 weeks old. Eliza was in the yard when the wagon came, and the driver handed her the stack of mail with the cheerful indifference of a man who delivers things for a living and does not concern himself with what they contain. She sorted through it and sighed. A bill from the feed supply, a notice about winter road conditions on the northern route, and a letter addressed to her in handwriting she recognized immediately and had not expected to see again. Her brother-in-law's hand. Robert's younger brother, Daniel Rowan, who lived in Cincinnati and who had been, after Robert's death, variously helpful and difficult, and ultimately someone she had put some distance between herself and before leaving Ohio. She sat down at the table and opened it. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The summary of it was this. The house in Milford that she had rented and then vacated had contained in storage several items belonging to Robert's estate that Daniel now believed were his by right of family succession, and he was writing to inform her that he intended to pursue the matter legally if she did not respond with her current location and an agreement to discuss the disposition of these items. The items in question were a writing desk, a set of books, and a pocket watch that had belonged to Robert's father. Eliza set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment. The desk had been a wedding gift to both of them from her own parents. The books she had read herself, twice each. The pocket watch. Robert had pressed it into her hand 3 days before he died, with the deliberate intention of someone who is getting things in order and knows it, and she had kept it in the bottom of her traveling bag for 3 years, wrapped in a handkerchief, and she had not looked at it often, but she had known it was there. She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, put it in her apron pocket. Thomas found her still sitting at the table 20 minutes later when he came in from school. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said, direct as always. "Nothing that needs to concern you," she said, and she said it gently but firmly, the way she'd learned to speak to him, honestly enough that he knew she wasn't dismissing him, but clearly enough that he knew where the line was. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his books on the table and sat down across from her. "Did someone die?" he asked. "No." "Is something wrong with the ranch?" "No." "Is it something from before you came here?" She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he read situations with the accuracy of someone twice his age, and she was not going to lie to him. "Yes," she said. "Something from before. I'll deal with it." He nodded, reached for his arithmetic book. "Okay," he said, and left it there, which was perhaps the most mature response available to him. She wrote back to Daniel that evening, after the children were in bed. She wrote it at the kitchen table by lamplight, and she wrote it in the voice she used when she needed to be precise and unmoved. She acknowledged the letter. She addressed each item. The desk had been purchased by her parents for their household, and she had documentation of this if he wished to pursue it. The books were her property. The watch had been given to her by Robert, personally, in the final days of his illness, in the presence of the doctor who attended him, and she would testify to that in any court in Ohio if it came to it. She did not give him her current address. She directed responses to the post office in Lander. She sealed the letter and set it out for the supply wagon and did not think about it again that night, or tried not to. Caleb found her at the window after midnight. He came downstairs for water and stopped when he saw her standing there, the letter to Daniel still on the table where she'd left it, the lamp burning low. "Eliza." She turned. She hadn't heard him come down. "Sorry," she said. "I couldn't sleep." He came into the kitchen, looked at the letter on the table, looked at her face, and did not ask the obvious question, which she appreciated. Instead, he moved to the stove and put the kettle on. "Tea," he said. "Not a question." "You don't have to." "I'm already up," he said. She sat down. He made the tea with the economical movements of someone doing a simple thing without ceremony, and he put a cup in front of her and sat across from her with his own, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Someone from before," she finally said. "You don't have to explain it." "I know." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "My brother-in-law, Robert's brother. He's decided certain things belong to him." Caleb was quiet. "The pocket watch," she said. "Robert's father's. He gave it to me." She looked at the table. "Daniel knows that. He was there when Robert and I married. He knows perfectly well what belonged to who. She paused. He's just testing to see if I'll argue. Will you? Yes, she said, flatly. I will. Something in Caleb's expression settled. Something that looked, she thought, like respect for the flatness of it. Do you need anything? He said. For it. Help with the letter, or... I've already written back, she said. He nodded, looked at his tea. You didn't have to deal with that alone tonight. It was late, she said, and I'm used to dealing with things alone. The words landed between them with a weight that surprised her. She hadn't meant them as anything other than statement of fact, but the fact itself was heavy, and they both felt it. You don't have to be, he said, quietly. Not pressing, just saying. She looked at him. He was looking at his tea, and she could see the effort in it. The effort of a man who has lived inside his own closed circuit for a long time, who is trying to extend something outward and is not entirely sure of the mechanism. His hands were around the mug, and there was that scar along the right one that she still hadn't asked about, and his hair was pushed back from sleep, and he looked not diminished by the informality of midnight in a kitchen, but more real than he did in the daylight hours. Less managed. Thank you, she said. For this. She meant the tea. She also meant the sitting here. She also meant something she didn't put into words. He looked up then, and what happened was very small. Barely anything, in the way that things that matter are often barely anything. He just held her gaze for a moment without the careful neutrality he usually kept in reserve, without the managed distance. Just looked at her, one tired person to another, in the middle of the night in a ranch kitchen in Wyoming, while the wind moved across the plain outside and the lamp burned between them. Then Clara called from upstairs, something wordless and worried, a sound from the edge of a bad dream, and Eliza was on her feet before she'd decided to be. I've got her, she said. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard Caleb say, very quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the empty kitchen, yeah, just that. One word. But she heard it, and she carried it up the stairs with her, and she sat on the edge of Clara's bed in the dark, and listened to the child's breathing, even out from frightened to peaceful, and she thought about all the things that hadn't been said in that kitchen, and whether they needed saying or whether they were already understood. She didn't have an answer. She had, instead, the specific warmth of being somewhere that had started, at the corners and in the quiet moments, to feel like it might hold her. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. But hold her the way a well-built house holds against weather. Not by refusing to feel the wind, but by being solid enough to bear it. In the morning, Clara woke cheerful and without memory of the dream, and asked whether there was any of the apple cake left from 2 days ago, and Eliza said there was half of one piece, and Clara could have it for breakfast if she didn't tell her brother, and Clara agreed to these terms with the solemnity of a treaty negotiation, and the day began the way days did, without ceremony, without conclusion, one foot and then the other. 2 months in, and the ranch had a different feeling than it did in those first raw weeks. Not easier, exactly. The work didn't ease, and the cold coming down off the ridge was getting serious now, the kind of cold that required planning rather than just endurance. But there was a rhythm to the days that hadn't existed before, a sense of things fitting into their proper slots, and that rhythm had changed the quality of the house in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Caleb noticed it most in the mornings. He'd spent 18 months waking into a kitchen that was cold and quiet and demanded things from him before he had the resources to give them. Now he came downstairs and there was heat already in the stove and coffee already on, and sometimes the sound of Eliza moving around in a way that wasn't intrusive but was present. The word he kept coming back to was present. She was present in the house the way Margaret had been, not identically, not as a replacement for something lost, but with a weight and a warmth that made the rooms feel inhabited rather than just occupied. He didn't say this to her. He wasn't sure he had the right language for it yet, and he was cautious about language in ways he hadn't been before Margaret died. You learn, after losing someone, that words have weight and that you cannot always predict where that weight will fall. What he did instead was small things. He fixed the parlor window latch without being asked, the week after she'd received the letter from Daniel Rowan. He came back from a trip to Lander with a pound of the specific tea she'd mentioned once, in passing, that she preferred over coffee in the evenings. He didn't present these things with any commentary. He just did them and let them be what they were. She noticed. He could tell she noticed the same way he could tell most things about her now. By the way, she didn't make a production of it, just received it quietly and went on. It was Thomas who broke the surface first, which surprised Caleb, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. Thomas had always been the child who worked things out internally and then announced his conclusions without warning, having apparently conducted the entire deliberation in private. It happened on a Sunday. Eliza had gone to the creek to gather the last of the watercress before the hard freeze took it, and Caleb was at the kitchen table going over the winter supply accounts. And Thomas came and sat across from him with the particular expression that meant he had something to say and was working out how to say it. Caleb put down his pencil. "What?" Thomas looked at the table. "Are you and Miss Eliza going to keep being married like this?" Caleb looked at his son. "What do you mean, like this?" Like you're being careful around each other." Thomas kept his eyes on the table. "Like you're both trying not to break something." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "That's a fairly grown-up observation," Caleb said. "I'm almost 10, Thomas said with some dignity. "You are." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "What's prompting this?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Clara asked me last night if Miss Eliza was going to stay forever or just for a while, and I didn't know what to tell her." He looked up. "I didn't know because I don't actually know, and I should know. We should know." Caleb looked at his son's face, at the 9-year-old version of his own features, carrying the 9-year-old version of the same question he'd been avoiding asking himself for 2 months. "What did you tell Clara?" "I told her I thought she was staying," Thomas said. "But that I'd ask you." A pause. "So I'm asking." "She's staying," Caleb said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure she intends to." Thomas looked at him steadily. "That's not the same as sure, Papa." No, it wasn't. And Thomas knew it, which meant Caleb had to sit with the fact that his 9-year-old son was more willing to name the uncertainty than he was. "No," Caleb said. "It's not the same." He picked up his pencil and set it down again. "What is it you're actually asking me, Thomas?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a gust came off the ridge and moved through the yard, rattling the loose boards on the fence. The stove ticked. "I'm asking if you're going to let her," Thomas said finally. "Stay. Not just be here and work and take care of things, but actually stay." He looked at his hands. "Because I think she would, if you let her." Caleb didn't say anything for a while. He looked at his son, who was staring at the table with the expression of someone who has said more than they're comfortable with and is waiting to see what it costs them. "When did you get so sharp?" Caleb said. Thomas shrugged one shoulder. "I pay attention." "You do," Caleb said. "You always have." He reached across the table and put his hand briefly on Thomas's arm. "I hear you." "Okay," Thomas said. He pushed back from the table. "I'm going to go help Pete with the fence." "Thomas." He stopped. "Thank you," Caleb said. Thomas nodded once and went out the back door, and Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table with the winter supply accounts open in front of him and his son's words sitting in the room like something solid. Eliza came back from the creek with her basket half full of watercress and her boots dark with mud from the bank, and she came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Caleb's face. "What happened?" she said. She set the basket on the counter. "Thomas asked me something," he said. "About what?" He looked at her. "About us." The words sat between them in a way it hadn't before. Not dramatically, just present, the way things are present when they've been circling for a long time and have finally landed. She didn't look away. What did he ask? Whether this marriage was going to keep being what it is, Caleb said, or whether something was going to change. She was quiet for a moment. She pulled off her muddy boots at the door and set them on the mat, taking her time with it in a way that told him she was deciding something. "What did you tell him?" she said. "That you were staying." "That's true," she said. He said that wasn't what he was asking. She looked at him then. Her hair had come loose at the back from the wind off the creek, and there was a smear of mud along her left wrist that she hadn't noticed, and she was standing in her stocking feet on the kitchen floor, and she looked, not like someone trying to manage a situation, but like someone who had stopped managing and was just standing in it. "He's not wrong," she said. "No," Caleb said. He's not. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a low, late fall angle, the kind of light that makes everything look deliberate. And Caleb thought about what Thomas had said, about letting her stay, not just tolerating her presence or being grateful for her competence or appreciating the way the house ran better and the children were calmer and the mornings were warmer, but actually letting her, which required something from him that he'd been keeping carefully behind glass for the better part of 2 years. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes. I have been—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been treating this like a transaction that's going well." He said it plainly, without self-pity. Like, as long as I'm fair and considerate and you have everything you need, that's enough. That's what I promised, and so that's what I'm doing. He looked at the table. And it isn't enough. I know it isn't. I've known it for a while. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him, which was the thing she did when she intended to be in a conversation fully rather than peripherally. "I've been doing the same thing," she said. He looked at her. "Being competent," she said. "Useful. Making sure the children are cared for and the house is running and you have one less problem to manage." She looked at her hands. "Because that's safe. That's the arrangement. If I'm good at the arrangement, then—" She stopped. "Then what?" he said. "Then I don't have to think about what I actually want," she said, quietly. "Because what I want has gotten me into difficulty before." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want, Eliza?" She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very still. "I want this to be real," she said. "Not an arrangement that functions well. Not a practical solution that both parties are satisfied with." She kept her voice even, but only just. "I want to belong here. Not because I'm useful to it, but because—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Because I think I already do. Belong here. And I don't know when that happened, and I didn't plan it, and it frightens me considerably." Something shifted in Caleb's face, something that had been held in place for a very long time. "The morning you arrived," he said. She looked at him. "You stepped down from that wagon," he said, "and you could barely stand up, and the first thing you said was that you'd understand if I wanted to send you back." He shook his head slightly. "I knew then. Not that I knew what to do with it, but I knew." "Knew what?" she said. Her voice was careful. She needed him to say it. "That you were someone I could—" He stopped. He was not a man who had easy access to this kind of language, and she could see the effort in it, the reaching for something that didn't come naturally. "That you were real," he said, finally. "Not what I'd built up in my head from letters. Not a solution. A person." And she scared the hell out of me. The afternoon light moved across the table between them. "I scared you," she said. "You walked off that wagon looking like you'd been through something serious, and instead of asking for comfort or sympathy, you immediately tried to manage my expectations," he said. "That scared me because it was something I do. And I don't generally—" He looked at the table. "I don't generally trust people who are like me." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "That's a strange compliment." "It's the truest one I have," he said. Clara came in from outside then, loud and immediate, bringing cold air and a long narrative about the barn cat and the doll bonnet, and the fact that Pete had found this very funny, and the moment broke open into the ordinary demands of afternoon. But it didn't disappear. It just redistributed itself around the edges of the next few hours, around supper and the children's baths, and the reading aloud that had become the evening ritual. Eliza reading while Clara leaned against her side, and Thomas pretended to be doing something else while clearly listening to every word. After the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Caleb and Eliza sat at the kitchen table again with the lamp between them, and the conversation from the afternoon was still in the room, present in the way that honest things are present once they've been said. "What do we do now?" she said. It wasn't a dramatic question. It was practical, the way she was practical. He looked at her. "I think we stop pretending we don't know what this is." "And what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something I didn't plan on," he said. "Something I thought I was past being able to feel." He said it without embarrassment, just directly. "I don't know what that's worth to you. I know you came here with specific expectations, and I know I don't—" "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "When you left tea on the kitchen counter 3 weeks ago," she said. "The specific kind, because I mentioned it once." He looked at her. I stood in this kitchen and held that tin for about 5 minutes, she said, because nobody had remembered something I mentioned once in years, since Robert. She looked at him steadily. That is what it's worth to me. He reached across the table. Slowly, without sudden movement, the way you move toward something you don't want to startle. He put his hand over hers on the table. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and rough from work, the scar along the outside edge that she'd wondered about since the first day. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, in the kitchen, with the lamp burning between them, and the wind outside doing what Wyoming wind did, and the house around them holding everything it held. The children sleeping, the memories of people who were gone, the careful accumulating days of two people trying to be honest with themselves and each other in a place that had no patience for anything less. The scar, she said after a while. On your hand. I've wondered since the first day. He looked down at their joined hands, a slight pull at the corner of his mouth. Fence wire, 10 years ago. I was moving fast and not paying attention. Does it hurt? Not anymore. She nodded. She thought that was probably true of more than the scar, and she thought he probably knew she was thinking that, and neither of them said it because they didn't have to. In the morning, it was Clara who noticed first, because Clara noticed everything that had to do with the emotional weather of the house with the accuracy of a small and highly calibrated instrument. She came downstairs and found her father and Eliza at the stove together, Caleb reaching past Eliza to get the coffee pot in a way that was different from how he usually moved around her. Closer, easier, without the careful maintained distance. And Clara stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at them with her wide blue eyes. Then she looked at Thomas, who had come down behind her and stopped at her shoulder. Thomas looked at the two adults at the stove. His face did its quick internal calculation. Finally, he said, under his breath. Clara grabbed his arm with both hands. Thomas, she whispered, are they? Yes, he said. How do you know? Because I pay attention, he said. Come on, let's get breakfast. He came into the kitchen and pulled out his chair and sat down, and Clara followed him, and Caleb and Eliza turned from the stove, and nobody said anything directly about what had changed. But the shape of the morning was different, and all four of them felt it, and the kitchen held them together in its warmth with a quality that had not been present before and could not be unfelt now that it was. Eliza set the biscuits on the table. Caleb poured the coffee. Clara immediately knocked her cup with her elbow and would have sent it off the edge of the table if Eliza hadn't caught it without breaking the sentence she was in the middle of. And Thomas looked at his sister with the suffering patience of someone who has lived with catastrophe for 9 years and built up a tolerance for it. Careful, Eliza said to Clara, handing back the cup. I know, Clara said. I'm always careful. 3 people at the table said nothing to this. The restraint was itself a kind of tenderness. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning to fall. Not the sleet of the storm 6 weeks ago, but actual snow, quiet and serious, the kind that settles and stays. It came down soft and even across the yard, across the barn roof and the fence line and the ridge to the north, turning the world white and new and indifferent to the particular human warmth inside the house that was, without announcement or ceremony, becoming something it had not been before. Caleb looked out the window at the snow, and then at Eliza, who was listening to Clara explain the injustice of Thomas being allowed to stay up later on account of being 9, a fact which in Clara's view had gone on long enough. He thought about what Thomas had said, about letting her stay, about the difference between someone being present in your life and someone being part of it. He thought he was beginning to understand the difference. The snow stayed. That was the first winter lesson Eliza learned about Wyoming. When it decided to snow, it committed. By the end of the first week of December, the yard was under 8 inches, and the ridge to the north had disappeared into a gray-white sky that blended into the land so completely there was no visible horizon. The world reduced itself to what you could see from the house, which was the barn, the fence line, the creek frozen at its edges, and the particular quality of light on snow that made everything look both beautiful and unforgiving. She had grown up with Ohio winters, which were cold and damp and miserable in a low-grade persistent way. This was different. This was cold that had conviction. The days compressed inward. Less time outside, more time in the house. The 4 of them occupying the same rooms in a proximity that stripped away what remained of formal distance. You cannot maintain careful politeness with someone when you are sharing a kitchen for 16 hours a day in temperatures that require you to wear your coat indoors until the stove gets going. The small frictions surfaced, Thomas's habit of leaving books open face down on every flat surface in the house, which Eliza found quietly maddening. Clara's tendency to ask questions in the exact moment when concentration was most required. Caleb's way of going entirely silent when he was worried about something, a silence so complete it took up physical space. And her own things, which she was honest enough to acknowledge. The way she reorganized spaces without asking, because her instinct was to fix inefficiency rather than defer. The way she sometimes snapped at Clara when she was tired, sharper than the situation warranted, and then had to go back and repair it. The way she woke at 3 in the morning, sometimes with her heart going too fast, disoriented in the dark of a room that still wasn't quite familiar enough to be automatic, and lay there thinking about Robert in the way grief ambushes you. Not continuously, not overwhelmingly, but in sudden specific flashes of him that were harder to manage in the winter dark than in the busy light of day. She was not perfect at this. None of them were. What they were was present and trying, and that turned out to be enough to build on. The conversation with the children happened on a Saturday morning in the second week of December, and it was Caleb who initiated it, which surprised her. She had expected it to come organically, gradually, in the way things between them had been coming, by accumulation rather than declaration. Instead, he came downstairs that Saturday looking like someone who had made a decision, and he asked the children to sit at the kitchen table, and he stood at the end of it the way a man stands when he has something to say that requires him to be on his feet for the saying of it. Thomas sat with his hands flat on the table, watching his father with that careful, reading expression. Clara sat with her chin in her hands and her elbows on the table in defiance of every table manners correction Eliza had ever offered her. Eliza stood near the stove, unsure whether she was part of this conversation or witness to it, and Caleb looked at her briefly and then pulled out the chair beside him, and that answered the question. She sat down. "I want to talk to you both about something," Caleb said. He looked at his children. "About this family, about what it is and what it's going to be." Clara's eyes went wide. Thomas didn't move. "When I wrote to Miss Eliza, and she agreed to come here, I told you it was because we needed help. Because running this place and taking care of you both was more than one person could do well." He paused. "That was true, but it was only part of the truth." "What's the other part?" Clara said. "The other part is that you both needed more than I knew how to give you," he said. "Not because I didn't love you, but because I was so deep inside my own grief that I couldn't see around it. And you were both grieving too, and I wasn't helping you with it the way you needed." He looked at the table for a moment. "I was doing my best. I want you to know that. But my best wasn't enough, and I knew it. And asking Eliza to come here was partly an honest acknowledgement of that." Thomas said nothing. He was looking at his father with an expression that was something between recognition and pain, and Eliza thought this was probably the most direct Caleb had ever been with his son about this, and she thought it was costing him something to say it, and she thought Thomas knew that too. "Is that why Mama's not here?" Clara said. "Because you weren't enough?" Caleb looked at his daughter. "No, sweetheart," he said, and his voice was entirely steady, which Eliza suspected took considerable effort. "Your mama died because she got sick. That had nothing to do with what I was or wasn't." He looked at Clara directly. "I need you to understand that." Clara studied him with the focused attention she brought to things she was trying to fully absorb. "Okay," she said, finally. "I believe you." Thomas let out a breath that was barely audible, but Eliza heard it. "What I want to tell you," Caleb continued, "is that what began as an arrangement, a practical thing, between two people who needed practical solutions, has become something different." He looked at Eliza then, and he said it to her as much as to the children. "It's become real. And I think you both already know that because you've been living in it. But I wanted to say it plainly because I think plain is better than leaving things unsaid and hoping everyone figures it out." "We figured it out weeks ago," Thomas said. Caleb looked at his son. "The morning after the first big snow," Thomas said, "the way you two were standing at the stove." He said it without embarrassment, just reporting. "I told Clara." "You said finally," Clara said, delighted to be corroborating this. "I did say that," Thomas confirmed. Caleb looked at Eliza. She had her hand pressed over her mouth, and she was not laughing, technically. "So," Caleb said, turning back to his children with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You already knew." "Yes, Papa," Clara said patiently. "And you're—" He stopped. "How do you feel about it?" Clara didn't hesitate. She looked at Eliza, and on her face was the same expression she'd worn on that very first evening, standing at the bottom of the staircase in a too-short dress with her hair half undone, looking at a mud-covered woman who had just walked in from the rain. That same undiluted certainty, that same open door of a face. "Is she our mother now?" Clara asked. "Really?" The kitchen went quiet. Not the tense quiet of something unresolved, but the held breath quiet of a moment that everyone in the room understands is significant. Eliza looked at Clara. She thought about all the ways she could answer this carefully, all the qualified, measured things she could say that would be technically accurate and emotionally safe, and would leave everyone with appropriate expectations and no one with too much at stake. She thought about a 6-year-old girl who had left a misspelled welcome note and dead wildflowers on a bedside table for a woman she'd never met. She thought about that same girl asking, on a rainy evening before she even knew Eliza's name, "Please be my mama." She thought about sitting in the dark through storms and the pantry story, and "I already decided," said with the finality of someone who has done their arithmetic and is satisfied with the answer. She got up from her chair. She crossed the kitchen and she crouched down in front of Clara, so they were eye to eye, and she looked at the small girl who had been waiting, in her way, since the first night, and she said, "Yes, if that's what you want." Clara's face did something extraordinary. Not a performance, not a theatrical response, but the real thing. The involuntary expression of a child who has been given something they wanted so badly they'd almost stopped believing they would get it. Her eyes filled up fast and immediate, and she threw herself forward and wrapped her arms around Eliza's neck the way she'd wrapped her arms around Eliza's waist on that very first night, and held on. Eliza held on back. She pressed her face briefly into Clara's hair, and she did not look at Caleb, and she did not look at Thomas, because she needed a moment that was just this, just the solid, warm weight of a child who had chosen her, and the understanding that she had chosen back, and what that meant for both of them. Thomas was quiet. When Eliza looked up, he was looking at them with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the watchful assessment, not the careful neutrality. Something younger than his usual face. Something that was maybe just a 9-year-old boy watching his sister get something she'd needed for a long time. "Thomas," Eliza said. Clara was still attached to her neck. "I know you're not 6, and I know this is different for you." He looked at her. "I'm not going to ask you to feel anything you don't feel," she said. "But I want you to know that what I said to Clara applies to you too, in whatever way it can." She paused. "You've let me in, quietly, on your own schedule, in your own way. I don't take that for nothing." Thomas looked at the table, back at her. Something moved through his expression that he didn't try to control, which for Thomas was the closest thing to an open door she was likely to get. "I know," he said, gruff and quiet and meaning it entirely. Caleb put his hand on his son's shoulder. Thomas let him. The morning continued the way mornings continued, with the kettle and the biscuits, and Clara eventually disentangling herself from Eliza to demand to know what was for breakfast. But the quality of the kitchen was different, and all 4 of them felt it, not in a clean or perfect way, but in the way real things feel. A little raw, a little uncertain, and unmistakably true. Daniel Rowan's second letter arrived in January. It was shorter than the first, as second letters from people who've received firm answers often are. He was no longer threatening legal action. He acknowledged that the pocket watch had been Robert's to give. He said, in the stiff, indirect way of a man who cannot quite bring himself to apologize, that he hoped she was well in her current situation. She wrote back 1 paragraph. She said she was well. She said she hoped he was also well. She wished him a decent winter. She sealed the letter, sent it with the supply wagon to Lander, and she felt the pass close gently around that particular chapter and stay closed. She told Caleb about it that evening. "That's the last of it?" he said. "That's the last of it," she said. He nodded. He didn't make a speech about it. He just reached over and refilled her tea without being asked, and that was its own kind of answer. Spring came the way Wyoming spring comes, not gradually, but in decisive lurches. A week of warmth followed by a killing frost, followed by 3 days of mud, followed by the first green appearing along the creek bank with an improbable stubbornness that struck Eliza as entirely appropriate for this landscape. The land did not ease into things. It committed, or it didn't. By March, Thomas had started showing her things about the ranch without being asked. Not in any formal way. He didn't announce he was doing it. But he'd say, walking past the east fence, "This section floods in spring, you have to watch it," or "The mare in the second stall gets colic if you change her feed too fast." Information delivered in passing, in the way you share knowledge about a place with someone you've decided belongs in it. She received it the same way he offered it, without making a ceremony of it. Ruth Halverson came in April, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee, and she looked at Eliza for a long moment with those assessing eyes that missed nothing, and then she said, with the particular bluntness that Eliza had come to appreciate, "You look different than you did in September." "6 months will do that," Eliza said. "Not always," Ruth said. "Sometimes 6 months just makes a person more tired." She looked at Eliza steadily. "You look like you've put down some weight." "I beg your pardon?" "Not the kind you lose," Ruth said, dry as creekstone in August. "The kind you carry, like you've set something heavy on the ground and started walking without it." Eliza considered this for a moment. It was, she thought, an accurate description of something she hadn't had language for herself. "I suppose I have," she said. Ruth picked up her coffee. "Good," she said, and that was the whole of it. Josephine Pratt came in May, when the creek was running high and the hills to the north had finally shed their snow and gone green. She came alone, which was different from before, and she sat with Eliza on the porch in the thin afternoon warmth, and they talked in the easy way of two people who have moved past the careful stage and arrived somewhere more honest. "She would have liked you," Josephine said after a while. Eliza looked at her. "Margaret," Josephine said, "I know that's a strange thing to say, but she would have. She was practical the way you're practical. No patience for pretense." She looked out at the yard. "She would have been glad, I think, for the children, for Caleb." She paused. "It took me a while to get to that. I want to be honest about that, but I'm there now." "I know it's not simple," Eliza said. "No," Josephine agreed, "but simple isn't the only kind of true." She looked at Eliza. "The kids are good. You can see it." "They're good kids," Eliza said. "That was true before I came." "It's more true now," Josephine said. "There's a difference." Eliza didn't argue with her. On an evening in late May, with the kitchen window open to the first genuinely warm air of the year, and Clara asleep upstairs and Thomas reading in the parlor, Eliza stood at the window and looked out at the ranch in the long blue light of a Wyoming dusk. Caleb came to stand beside her, not touching, just beside. The way they stood now, in the same space without the careful distance that had characterized the first weeks, when they were both measuring everything, calibrating, keeping margins. She thought about September, about a wagon with a cracked axle and a mud-covered dress and shaking hands on the reins, about stepping down onto ground she didn't know and bracing herself for a rejection that didn't come. She thought about how little she had understood, then, about what she was walking into. Not the difficulty. She'd been right about that. But the rest of it. The way a household gets into you when you've lived in it long enough. The way children do. The way a man who is careful with his words and generous with small, quiet actions does, if you pay attention. She had her traveling bag still. It was in the closet of her room. Their room now, since November. A change that had happened with very little fanfare and considerable awkwardness, and then, gradually, had simply become the way things were. And in that bag, wrapped in a handkerchief, was Robert's father's pocket watch. She still hadn't moved it to a drawer. She still hadn't decided what to do with it. She thought maybe that was all right. Maybe some things don't need to be decided. Maybe you just carry them differently as time passes, and the weight changes not because you've set them down, but because you've gotten stronger. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb said. She looked at him. At this man who had held a door open in the rain without making a speech about it, who had fixed a window latch without being asked, who had remembered a tin of tea, who had sat across from his son and heard him, who had stood up at the kitchen table one Saturday morning and said, "I want to tell you something plain," because he'd decided that plain was better than leaving things unsaid. "September," she said. He looked at her. "Which part?" "The door," she said. "You didn't say anything. You just stepped aside." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd already been through enough," he said. "You didn't need a speech on top of it." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back out at the yard, where the last of the daylight was sitting on the ridge, and the barn cat was moving through the fence shadows with his tail up, going wherever barn cats go in the long evenings. She had a blue dress in her closet. She'd never thrown it out. It was beyond mending. The mud stains had set, the hem was torn at 2 points, the left sleeve had a rip along the seam from a fence she'd grabbed when the wagon lurched. Practically speaking, it had no further use. Practically speaking, she should have cut it for rags in October. She kept it because it was the dress she'd been wearing when she knocked on this door. When she stood in the rain and said, "I understand if you want me to leave," and a man she'd never met stepped aside and held the door open, and a child she'd never seen came down a staircase and wrapped her arms around her waist, and something that had been very small and very frightened in her had looked around at all of it and thought, "Stay." She had stayed. She thought about all the ways the stories she'd told herself about her life had been about endurance, about getting through things, surviving things, holding herself together through things. Robert's death, the years after, the journey here. She'd been so focused on the surviving that she hadn't noticed until she was already inside it that surviving had tipped over somewhere into something else. Into this kitchen, and this ridge, and these children, and this man standing beside her in the blue Wyoming evening. You don't get to choose when that happens. You just get to choose whether you let it. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad I knocked." He turned to look at her, and something in his face did the thing it had done in the kitchen that first night she'd really seen it. That slight unguarding, that brief visible softness in a face that was generally careful with what it showed. "So am I," he said. Clara's voice came down from upstairs then, calling for Eliza in the tone that meant she was not actually awake, but not quite asleep either, navigating the borderland the way she always did, loudly, with assistance required. Eliza pushed off the window frame. "I'll go," she said. She went up the stairs, stepping over the third board from the top the way she'd learned to do in the first weeks, and she went into Clara's room where the child was lying with her eyes half open and her hair in its usual state of entropy, and she sat on the edge of the bed. "I wasn't asleep," Clara said. "I know. I was just resting." "That's fine." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "Miss Eliza?" Eliza had let the miss stand. It was Clara's particular bridge between what she'd learned to call adults and what she was working up to, and Eliza was not going to rush it. "Yes? Are we a real family now?" Eliza looked at her. At this small person who had asked her, in various forms, the same essential question since the first night, "Are you staying? Are you real? Are you mine?" and who deserved every time the same honest answer. "Yes," Eliza said. "We are." Clara considered this with her eyes almost closed. Even though it started weird, "Most real things start weird," Eliza said. "That doesn't make them less real." A pause, then, "Thomas said families are just people who decide to keep showing up for each other." Eliza looked at the ceiling for a moment. Thomas, she thought, was going to be a remarkable person. "Thomas is right," she said. "He's right a lot," Clara said, with the generosity of someone who can afford to be magnanimous. "Don't tell him I said that." "I won't." The child's breathing was evening out. Eliza sat in the particular quiet of that room and looked at the tin cup on the windowsill. New wildflowers in it now, spring ones, purple and yellow, the dried ones from September long gone. And she thought about decisions. About the ones you make deliberately, and the ones you make by simply not leaving when you could have. About the ones that look small from the outside and change everything from the inside. She had knocked on a door. A man had stepped aside. A child had held on. Another child had watched from a careful distance and then, in his own time, had let her in. And here she was. She was not the woman who had stepped off that wagon in September. That woman had been surviving. This woman, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room she knew, in a house she belonged to, in a family that had been built not from perfect circumstances, but from the accumulated weight of small, honest choices made daily by imperfect people. This woman was doing something different. She was living. The wildflowers on the windowsill caught the last blue light of the evening. Outside, across the Wyoming plain, the land stretched out in every direction without apology, vast and difficult and shot through with a beauty that didn't care whether you noticed it or not. It had been here before any of them, and it would be here after. That used to feel like a threat in the first weeks, when the scale of the country made her feel small and provisional. Now it felt like something else, like being part of something larger than yourself without being swallowed by it, like the difference between being exposed to the weather and being someone who knows the land well enough to read it. She had learned to read this land. She was still learning. She would be learning for years, probably, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to go. She sat with Clara until the child's breathing went slow and certain, and then she got up quietly, and she went back down the stairs to the kitchen where the lamp was burning, and Caleb was at the table with his coffee, and Thomas had relocated from the parlor and was reading in the chair by the stove. And nobody said anything when she came in, because she was simply part of the room now, and nothing about her arrival in it required acknowledgement. She poured herself tea and sat down. The ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around them. The lamp burned between them all. And outside, in the dark Wyoming spring, something was growing.